My mum was a singer and a dancer. They used to have like a musical comedy act.
For decades, Led Zeppelin fans believed they were watching four best friends create magic together. But at 79, John Paul Jones just shattered that dream completely. In a shocking confession, he revealed the band members weren't actually friends at all. They rarely spoke outside of work. They never hung out together. It was purely business. Jones compared it to hiring strangers for a job. But that's not even the most surprising part. The real truth about what held Zeppelin together will change how you see rock history forever. John Richard Baldwin was born on January 3, 1946, in the quiet London suburb of Sidcup. At first glance, it was an ordinary start, the kind nobody would expect for a boy who would one day help shape the sound of rock music. But Sidcup in 1946 was still scarred by the war. More than 200 homes had been destroyed by bombing, families were displaced, and rationing continued to grind down daily life. The street where John first opened his eyes was lined with modest two-story houses, many worth no more than £800 at the time. Children played in craters left by falling bombs, and veterans still haunted by battle filled the neighborhood. From this unlikely setting, a future musical genius quietly began his journey. Music was in his blood. John's father, Joe Baldwin, had been a pianist and the principal arranger for Bert Ambrose's orchestra, one of the most prestigious dance bands in Britain. The orchestra performed for high society in the Mayfair Hotel, and Joe's arrangements were heard by royalty and some of the most celebrated singers of the time. John's mother was also a trained pianist who performed in theaters and on BBC radio. Their home wasn't just filled with music, it was built on it. A Steinway piano sat in the living room, worth more than most people earned in a year, and shelves overflowed with thousands of orchestral arrangements. From the start, John was surrounded by the tools of greatness, but the glamorous careers of his parents came with a painful cost. At the age of 7, John was sent to Christ's College, a strict Anglican boarding school in Blackheath, while his parents traveled for months at a time. The school fees were high, but the emotional price was far greater. During Christmas breaks, while most boys went home, John remained in the cold dormitories, one of only a handful left behind. Letters he wrote showed a child aching with loneliness, yet determined to find comfort in the music rooms where he would spend hours practicing. The discipline of the school was harsh, but music became his escape. He would sit at the piano or organ for as long as 10 hours a day, pouring his isolation into practice that sharpened his skill far beyond his years. By the time he was 6, he could play Bach pieces that challenged professional musicians. At 9, he was performing Chopin flawlessly. At 14, he had already become the choir master and organist at St. Bartholomew's Church, leading a 40-member choir despite still being a schoolboy. He earned £3 a week for his work, enough to support himself, and he brought new life to the church service by blending traditional hymns with the jazz harmonies he had begun experimenting with. Locals called him a boy wonder, though behind the title was a teenager who still wrestled with the weight of being left behind. A turning point came when John was 16. He heard Phil Upchurch's bass solo on "You Can't Sit Down," and it struck him like lightning. Unlike anything he had heard before, the bass wasn't just keeping rhythm, it was leading the song. Inspired, John rushed to London's Denmark Street and bought his first bass guitar, a Dallas Tuxedo, spending nearly all his earnings from the church. The shopkeeper remembered how the quiet young man stayed for hours, playing with a focus that stunned everyone who listened. From that day forward, John practiced relentlessly, sometimes up to 12 hours a day, blending his classical background with the rhythmic freedom he had discovered. Within 6 months, he was playing professional session work around London. At 17, he landed a major break, performing with Jet Harris and Tony Meehan, two stars fresh from the shadows. Their single, Diamonds, recorded in 1963, shot straight to #1 on the UK charts, and John was part of it. While most teenagers were still in school, he was already playing on a record that sold 250,000 copies in its first week. For the next several years, John lived two lives. By day, He was the anonymous session musician behind the biggest names in British music. He played on as many as 6 to 8 sessions a week, sometimes dashing from one London studio to another with barely a break. He earned £15 a session, enough to keep going, but far from the fame or fortune his music was bringing others. At night, he returned to his modest flat, often too tired to do more than collapse into bed. The schedule left him with chronic back pain and sleepless nights, yet it built the versatility and speed that would later become his trademark. His fingerprints were all over the music of the 1960s, though his name rarely appeared in the credits. He arranged strings for Dusty Springfield's Son of a Preacher Man, played bass on the Rolling Stones' She's a Rainbow, and contributed to early tracks for Rod Stewart and Cat Stevens. He even worked extensively with Tom Jones, helping shape the sound of the album that launched him to stardom. Yet in every case, he was paid a flat fee and sent on his way, his contributions hidden behind the curtain. Everything shifted when he worked with Donovan on Sunshine Superman. The song's unique blend of pop, jazz, and Indian instruments needed someone who could make the parts fit together seamlessly, and John's arrangements delivered exactly that. The track became a #1 hit in America, and producer Mickey Most soon brought him onto dozens of other projects. It was through this connection that John met Jimmy Page, a fellow session musician, and the two began crossing paths more often. Between 1966 and 1968, John's workload became almost impossible. He took part in nearly 900 sessions during those 3 years, sometimes 3 in a single day. He became one of the most sought-after musicians in London, yet he felt more exhausted than fulfilled. On August 12, 1968, Maureen Jones sat in her Chorleywood home reading Disc Weekly when a small article caught her eye. It said that Jimmy Page was putting together a new group after the Yardbirds had played their final show in Luton the previous month. The piece mentioned he needed a bass player and a drummer. Maureen immediately turned to her husband and said, "You should call Jimmy about this new band." At first, John Paul Jones hesitated. He had earned $8,000 in 1967 from session work, which would be worth about $140,000 today. And he didn't want to risk such a steady income, but Maureen pressed the point, reminding him that session work was becoming less secure as bands preferred using their own musicians. She even dialed Page's number herself and handed him the phone. That short conversation the next day changed everything. Page offered Jones not just a spot in the band, but equal partnership. It was the moment Led Zeppelin truly began. Years later, Jones admitted something that shocked many fans. In a 1975 Rolling Stone interview, he explained that even though he had worked with Page almost daily for 4 years, they were never close. They never went for drinks, never visited each other's homes, and never even shared lunch. Their bond was built only on music. Between 1964 and 1968, Page worked around 180 sessions a year, while Jones handled about 200. They met only at work, yet together they developed a musical understanding so strong it seemed almost telepathic. Jones even revealed he didn't know Page's home address until 1968, despite working alongside him for years. Strangely, the lack of personal closeness made their partnership even stronger in the studio. Without personal distractions, they focused only on making the music perfect. This approach fit the unspoken rule of London's session scene at the time. Musicians didn't hire their friends. If a friend failed in a session, it could ruin a recording that cost $25 an hour, a huge sum in 1965. Contractors earned a commission on every player they booked, so they couldn't afford to risk hiring anyone unreliable. Both Jones and Page were chosen again and again, not out of loyalty, but because they always delivered. Page later said, "John was the most reliable bass player in London. He never missed a session, never came unprepared, and never let ego interfere with the music." It was that kind of reputation that convinced Page to bring Jones into his new project. When the Yardbirds officially broke up in July 1968, Page faced a problem. They still had touring contracts in Scandinavia, and canceling wasn't an option. So he came up with a bold solution. He recruited Jones, a young singer named Robert Plant, and a powerful drummer named John Bonham, then sent them on the road under the name The New Yardbirds. Fans thought they were seeing the old band, but what they actually witnessed was the birth of Led Zeppelin. Behind the scenes, Page and manager Peter Grant quickly set up a company called Super Hype Tapes to control the band's earnings and publishing. Jones later admitted that Led Zeppelin wasn't a group of friends who stumbled into success. It was carefully built by Page. He said, Led Zeppelin wasn't manufactured exactly, but it was put together by Jimmy. Page had deliberately chosen musicians he knew could deliver at the highest level. Jones, already respected as an arranger for songs like the Rolling Stones' She's a Rainbow, brought unmatched technical skill. While fans loved the image of four young men playing together out of sheer chemistry, the truth was more businesslike. Page even kept majority control of the band's finances, holding 80% of Superhype, while Jones and Plant had no ownership at all. Even as Zeppelin became the biggest band in the world, their personal relationships stayed distant. Jones said bluntly, "We weren't friends. They worked together like colleagues in a company, each focused on the job." Page had picked Plant and Bonham after a recommendation from singer Terry Reid, and the four hardly knew each other when they first rehearsed. But the music came together instantly. Within days, they had arranged songs like Dazed and Confused and How Many More Times. Page later said, "We knew we had something special from that first rehearsal. The musical connection was immediate, even though we barely knew each other." What made it work was their backgrounds. Page and Jones had years of experience as session players, trained to deliver exactly what was needed, without wasted time. Plant brought raw, youthful energy, while Bonham redefined rock drumming with his power and precision. Together, they created a sound that felt deeply emotional, even though they were not personally close. The professional respect between Page and Jones formed the backbone of it all. Both had spent years shaping British pop and rock records behind the scenes, from Donovan to Joe Cocker, before they ever stood on stage together as Led Zeppelin. Jones's role in the band went far beyond bass. He changed the way rock bass lines were written, turning them into lead parts rather than background support. On Ramble On, his flowing arpeggios created a sound few had ever heard before. On the Lemon Song, he delivered what many call the finest blues rock bass performance ever recorded, weaving complex rhythms around Bonham's drumming. His contributions on Kashmir added a Middle Eastern edge that made the song timeless. He was not just a bassist, but a composer whose lines often defined the music itself. Fans often focused on Page's guitar heroics, but Jones was the quiet architect behind many of Zeppelin's greatest moments. He played keyboards, mandolin, and even arranged horns and strings. His work on songs like The Rain Song and No Quarter gave the band a richness far beyond typical rock groups. Live, he sometimes played keyboards and bass pedals at the same time, making four men sound like an entire orchestra. His training allowed him to bring classical and jazz influences into their music, giving Zeppelin their distinctive sound. Unlike his bandmates, Jones avoided the wild rock star lifestyle. After shows, he often left the hotel to walk city streets alone, blending in with locals rather than joining late-night parties. He valued his family life with his wife Maureen and their daughters, even as fame surrounded him. At one point, he considered leaving the band to become a church choir master, though he was persuaded to stay. He admitted he had his share of excesses, but he was careful to avoid the scandals and dangers that consumed others in the band. More than anything, Jones's discipline kept Led Zeppelin together. He brought the work ethic of a seasoned session musician, always prepared and always professional. Their debut album was recorded in just 36 hours, thanks in large part to the preparation he demanded. Manager Peter Grant once said he never wanted to hear the word "can't" from anyone working with the band. Jones embodied that attitude. By the late 1970s, Led Zeppelin was no longer the tight unit that had once stormed the world stage. Inside the band, two very different groups had formed. Robert Plant and John Paul Jones worked with discipline, showing up on time and keeping their focus. On the other side, Jimmy Page was sinking deeper into heroin, while John Bonham struggled heavily with alcohol. They weren't just drifting apart in lifestyle, they were clashing in how they approached the music itself. Jones later admitted they weren't really friends off stage at all, and the tension made the atmosphere so toxic that it often felt like two separate bands trying to share the same space. The recording of their 1976 album, Presence, showed just how deep the cracks had become. Plant was still recovering from a serious car accident and wanted to be home with his family, yet the band pushed forward. Page worked nearly around the clock, sometimes for 20 hours at a stretch, refusing to sleep as he tried to finish the guitar parts. Plant admitted later that his vocals sounded strained, but there was no going back. The record itself was stripped down, with no keyboards and almost no acoustic guitar, as if the band was desperately trying to prove it could still make pure hard rock. Plant later called it a cry for survival, a sign that they were holding on by a thread. 2 years later, their final studio album showed just how much things had shifted. With Page and Bonham often absent, Plant and Jones took control of the sessions. Jones's new Yamaha synthesizer dominated the songs, and for the first time, Page barely contributed to some tracks. Bonham didn't receive a single writing credit. It was a shocking reversal for a band that had always been driven by Page's guitar. While Plant and Jones felt they were keeping the band alive, the sound left some members frustrated, especially those who still longed for Zeppelin's raw, guitar-heavy style. By then, the group barely worked together in the same room. Jones described the process as ships passing in the night. Plant and he would record during the day, while Page and Bonham stumbled into the studio late at night after heavy drinking and drug use. Much of the music was pieced together from these separate sessions, with Page and Bonham often delivering work that Plant and Jones had to patch together. The legendary unity that had once set Zeppelin apart was gone. Everything came crashing down on September 25th, 1980. Bonham had spent the previous day drinking heavily, downing around 40 shots of vodka over just 12 hours. That night, after passing out at Page's home, he never woke up. He was only 32. The official cause was choking on his own vomit, but the sheer amount of alcohol he consumed told the real story of how far his addiction had taken him. When John Paul Jones found Bonham's body the next morning, his reaction was calm and practical. He later said it was terrible, but almost immediately, he moved to tell the others and start dealing with the situation. For Jones, the moment confirmed that the band couldn't continue. Within weeks, the remaining members made the decision to disband. Their public statement was brief and businesslike, stressing that Zeppelin couldn't exist without Bonham. The choice was unanimous, more like a boardroom decision than an emotional plea. Fans mourned the loss of one of the greatest rock bands in history, but behind the scenes, there was also a sense of relief. The endless chaos, addictions, and infighting had finally reached a breaking point. Yet the story didn't end there. In 1994, Robert Plant and Jimmy Page reunited for an MTV project that quickly turned controversial. The reunion, called Unleaded, left out John Paul Jones completely. It wasn't an oversight, it was a deliberate decision, one that showed just how little loyalty remained. To make matters worse, they performed No Quarter, a song built around Jones's signature keyboard work, without even inviting him to join. It was a stinging reminder that his role in the band had never been fully valued. When Zeppelin was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame the following year, Jones took the stage and delivered a short but unforgettable line. "Thank you, my friends, for finally remembering my phone number." The audience laughed, but the meaning was sharp. He was publicly calling out his bandmates for cutting him out of the project, and everyone knew it. That fracture never truly healed. Even when the surviving members came together years later for the 2007 Celebration Day concert, the old wounds lingered. For fans, Led Zeppelin remained a symbol of rock's golden age. But inside the band, the truth was far less romantic. They had made history together, but in the end, their story was as much about business and ego as it was about friendship and music. After nearly 2 decades of silence following the end of Led Zeppelin, John Paul Jones finally stepped forward on his own. On September 6, 1999, he released Zuma, a bold, fully instrumental album that lasted just under 48 minutes. What surprised everyone was the sheer weight of the music. Jones played most of the instruments himself, using massive 4, 10, and even 12-string bass guitars to create sound so heavy that critics said they foreshadowed the hard rock he would later make, with Them Crooked Vultures. Drummer Pete Thomas joined him, along with Trey Gunn from King Crimson and Paul Leary of the Butthole Surfers. Tracks like Zuma and Bee Fingers left critics stunned, proving that Jones was far more than the quiet man in Zeppelin's shadow. He showed that he could build towering walls of sound on his own. 2 years later, on June 15, 2001, Jones released The Thunder Thief. This time, he shocked fans again by stepping up to the microphone himself. It was the first time he sang on his solo work, and the 46-minute record stretched his talents in every direction. He played everything from bass and steel guitar to mandolin, piano, organ, and even unusual instruments like the koto and autoharp. The album's lyrics came from experimental writer Peter Blegvad, while King Crimson's Robert Fripp contributed guitar solos. Jones mixed progressive rock with folk, delivering moments as haunting as his arrangement of Down to the River to Pray. Even Rolling Stone praised his willingness to explore new ground. The wildest turn came with Shibuya Bop, a jazz fusion piece that proved Jones could bend any genre to his will. He wasn't just stepping out of Zeppelin's shadow anymore, he was carving entire musical paths of his own. In 2009, Jones stunned the rock world once again when he joined forces with Foo Fighters' Dave Grohl and Queens of the Stone Age's Josh Homme. The result was Them Crooked Vultures, a supergroup that felt like the fulfillment of a long-held dream. Grohl had spoken about the idea as far back as 2005, and when the band finally appeared, they debuted in Chicago with a secret midnight show on August 9, 2009. The set lasted 80 minutes, filled with entirely original songs. Their self-titled debut album landed at number 12 on the Billboard 200 later that year, and in 2011 they took home a Grammy for Best Hard Rock Performance with New Fang. At 63, Jones was proving that age had not dulled his ability to create cutting-edge rock alongside musicians half his age. In 2022, the group reunited to honor Taylor Hawkins, reminding fans that Jones remained as relevant as ever, 4 decades after Zeppelin's glory days. Jones then surprised the world by diving into classical music with an opera called The Ghost Sonata. Inspired by August Strindberg's 1907 play, he began the project around 2010 with librettist Helen Cooper. The story followed a student drawn into a mysterious mansion in Stockholm, filled with betrayal and psychological tension. Unlike his rock work, Jones avoided electronics completely, explaining that a full orchestra was already a huge synthesizer. A brochure released in 2017 announced performances planned for the 2019 to 2020 season, calling for a complete symphony orchestra and multiple vocal roles. The project proved that Jones could move into classical composition with the same intensity and imagination he brought to rock. Few musicians from his generation ever made such a leap, let alone did it so convincingly. Beyond his solo work, Jones built a legacy of collaborations that few in the music world could match. Since Zeppelin's end, he has worked with names as varied as R.E.M., Brian Eno, Paul McCartney, Peter Gabriel, Ben E. King, Heart, the Foo Fighters, and even the Butthole Surfers. His partnership with avant-garde theater company La Fura dels Baus drew him into experimental performance art, while his work with Brian Eno pushed him into ambient and electronic soundscapes. In 2021, he took part in the United Nations Peace Through Music event, performing When the Levee Breaks to support environmental causes. Moving easily from rock icons to punk bands to world music events, Jones showed he could adapt to anything, always bringing his unique sound. Yet the most surprising moment came not from music, but from words. In a 2007 interview that resurfaced years later, Jones finally admitted something that startled fans. "We weren't friends," he said of Led Zeppelin. For decades, the band had been seen as a tight brotherhood, but Jones revealed that off-stage, their relationship was strictly professional. They rarely saw each other outside of tours and recording sessions. He explained that this distance may have been the very thing that kept them together, as long as they were. By avoiding personal entanglements, they sidestepped the tensions that tore apart so many other bands of the era. Jones compared it to his years as a session musician, when it was a rule never to book your friends for studio work. That distance allowed Zeppelin to survive even during their most turbulent years. Now at 79, Jones continues to surprise. He has spent the past several years creating a new classical song cycle for the celebrated mezzo-soprano Dame Sarah Connolly. Originally planned for 2025, its premiere is now set for January 8, 2026, at London's Wigmore Hall. Written for a Piero ensemble of piano, flute, clarinet, violin, and cello, the piece is the result of a 7-year collaboration. Jones carefully chose poems by both American and British writers, saying that finding the right verses was the hardest part of the process. Dame Sarah herself has spoken of her excitement, calling Jones a gifted composer and recalling her love for Led Zeppelin in her youth. The work will debut with pianist Joseph Middleton and the Britten Sinfonia, marking yet another chapter in Jones's extraordinary journey.